Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH, and today we're looking at Araumi of the Dead Tide. So this list is built around Araumi of the Dead Tide, a 3-mana Dimir commander. It's a 1/4, and it says tap, exile cards from your graveyard equal to the number of opponents you have. Target creature card in your graveyard gains Encore until end of turn. The Encore cost is equal to its mana cost, and Encore is you can exile the creature from the graveyard by paying its cost, and for each opponent you create a token copy of it that attacks that opponent this turn if able. They gain haste, and you sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. Activate only as a sorcery. So what we're going to want to do here is we obviously want creatures that benefit from having multiple copies of them, so ETB triggers, death triggers, etc. And now for EDH, rather than sorting by mana value or color, which would normally be how you'd build a normal list. So for example, if I pull up Scam, so this is modern Scam, but this can really apply to any non-EDH deck. So in typical 1v1 competitive formats, you're going to have a list like this, and you're going to typically want to break it down into mana values because tempo and casting things on curve matters a lot in the 60-card competitive formats. Maybe you'd break it down by color if you were interested in, like, well, how many pitch cards do I have for Fury? How many pitch cards do I have for Grief? That might be relevant, but a lot of the time you're going to be looking at it based on mana value and then have a sideboard that's separated from that. Now in EDH, that's not really helpful. So mana values in a curve do still matter, but a lot of the time it's more helpful to break it down into exactly what the cards in the deck are doing. So I've broken them down into all of the various categories of things that the deck is trying to do. So these categories are going to be typically you've got your commander, you've got your lands, and then you've got various categories that you have the cards in. So card draw, combo pieces, fast mana, ramp, sweepers, reanimation effects specifically in this deck. Then you might have some other cards that are miscellaneous uncategorized cards. You've got your tutors, counter spells, some lists might have spot removal, etc. So let's go through the list one at a time and figure out exactly what we're doing here. So Bolas's Citadel, this is just a great card advantage piece that I think should be in almost every black deck. Then we've got Broodbirth Viper. This is a 5-mana 3/3 with Myriad, which means when it attacks for each other opponent than the defending player, you make a token copy that's attacking them. And in Broodbirth Viper's case, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. So the reason this is good is because if you Araumi it with Encore, you give it Encore, you get 3 copies of Broodbirth Viper, and then all of them attack different opponents, and then they all trigger their Myriad abilities, which means you're going to have a total of 9 Broodbirth Vipers, and then draw some amount of cards depending on how many of them get through. Then there's Careful Study because we need to filter cards. We also need to get Encore targets into our graveyard, and we need to fill up the graveyard so that we can pay for the Encore cost of Araumi. There's Floating Dream Zubara, which is another great card to Encore, because when it dies, which it will as a result of sacking at the end step to Encore, it will trigger and draw a card, and then the next one will trigger and draw 2 cards, and the next one will trigger and draw 3 cards. And of course, if you have a way to sack them at instant speed rather than due to their trigger, you can sack one, hold priority, sack the second one, hold priority, sack the third one, and then all of them see that you've sacrificed 3 Zubaras, and all of them trigger to draw you 3 cards each. Frantic Search, same basic concept as Careful Study. We've got Lorien Revealed, that's fine. Mindblade Render. Whenever your opponents are dealt combat damage, if any of that damage was dealt by a warrior, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. It itself is a warrior. So if you Encore if you Encore Mindblade Render into play, then you'll have 3 copies of it. And then every single one of them will trigger for every other one of them that hits. So assuming that you can hit with all 3 of them will draw 3 cards. Similarly, Mole Drifter will just draw you 6 cards straight up when you Encore it. And then we've got our usuals, Mystic Remora, Aristic Study. Skull Clamp is particularly good in this deck as we're making a bunch of token copies that are going to die anyway, so we can Skull Clamp them. We've got Windfall. Then we've got our combo pieces. So anything that untaps Araumi can allow us to Encore multiple things out of the graveyard in the same turn. So for that, we've got Apheto Alchemist, Fate Stitcher, Freed from the Real, Kelpie Guide, Pemin's Aura, and Vizier of Tumbling Sands, but all of these cards also combo with Mesmeric Orb. Mesmeric Orb mills a player whenever they untap a permanent, so if you Encore out any of these creatures that untap stuff, like Apheto Alchemist, Vizier, etc., you'll have multiple copies of these untappers in play, then each of them can untap the other one, which will trigger Mesmeric Orb over and over and over to mill over your entire deck, at which point we will have Thassa's Oracle in the graveyard, along with Dread Return. And since we have 3 creatures in play as a result of Araumi encoring them anyway, we can Dread Return the 3 creatures to get back Oracle and win the game. The same applies if we have Mesmeric Orb and then any of these creatures to begin with. So if we have like Pemenzora, Fate Stitcher, like Pemenzora plus Fate Stitcher, let's say, right? So we have a Fate Stitcher in play, we have a Pemenzora attached to the Fate Stitcher, and we have Mesmeric Orb. The Fate Stitcher can untap a land that produces a blue mana. Then the Pemen's Orb can be activated to untap the Fate Stitcher, which will trigger Mesmeric Orb. Then you can tap the Fate Stitcher to untap the blue land and repeat over and over and over until you mill your whole library and get the Oracle trigger. On top of that, we've got Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar, which are great cards when we're going to be sacking all of these things anyway, since we get extra mana out of them. And they can, of course, combo with stuff like Floating Dream Zubra to sack all the cards simultaneously. But there are also combos that we can execute by getting the mana from these altars, which I'll describe in a bit. Then, of course, since we have Thassa's Oracle in the deck anyway, we may as well run Demonic Consultation and Tainted Pact to combo with it in another way, aside from the Mesmeric Orb Dread Return combo. We've got Peregrine Drake, which is a great card to bring back with Encore. Since it untaps 5 lands, we get 3 Peregrine Drakes, all of them trigger, and we can float the mana from our lands in response to the Peregrine Drake, getting way more mana than we spend to get it in the first place. We also have Rings of Brighthearth, which can be comboed with Araumi and get multiple Encores with it, or other effects that we might have in the deck. Then there's Unctus, which does various things, but specifically it has for its first effect, other blue creatures you control have, whenever this creature becomes tapped, draw a card, then discard a card. So this is like having another Mesmeric Orb when we have multiple untappers. We can simply tap and untap them back and forth, triggering Unctus over and over and over to loot our entire deck rather than mill it and go with Thassa's Oracle combo in that direction. Then we got Specimen Collector. This is yet another combo in the deck. It is a 5 mana 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 green squirrel token and a 0/3 blue crab token. And when it dies, you create a token that's a copy of target token you control. So, because Araumi encores and creates token copies of things, if you encore Specimen Collector, you'll have 3 token copies of Specimen Collector. Then give any sack outlet, such as Phyrexian Altar or Ashnod's Altar. You can sacrifice one of the Specimen Collectors, and it will generate a squirrel, a crab, and it will copy a token that you have, which can be one of the other token copies of Specimen Collector, thus basically going infinite because you can keep sacking the token copy of Specimen Collector to make another Specimen Collector, along with a squirrel and an 0/3 crab, resulting in infinite 1/1 squirrels, infinite 0/3 crabs, and infinite mana with Phyrexian Altar / Ashnod's Altar. Then we've got Scholar of the Ages. This is a 7 mana 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, you return up to 2 target instant and or sorcery cards from your graveyard to your hand. We can combine this with 2 instants and or sorceries that do both of the following effects. We can sacrifice the Scholar to generate mana, and we can reanimate the Scholar. So, we have certain fast mana effects that result in sacrificing a creature, such as Culling the Weak and Sacrifice. Culling the Weak sacks a creature to generate quadruple black, and Sacrifice sacks a creature to generate black mana equal to its casting cost, so 7 in the case of Scholar of Ages. And then as long as we have any sort of reanimation effect, such as Persist, for example, we can loop both of them back and forth to keep looping Scholar of Ages over and over and over to generate infinite mana and get our spells back again and again. So, let's say we have Culling the Weak plus Persist plus Scholar of Ages. So if Scholar of Ages is in our graveyard, we persist it back into play, and we Culling the Weak it, right? So the Scholar of Ages gets our 2 spells back, Persist and Culling the Weak. Then we persist the Scholar back, and we Culling the Weak it again. It costs 2 to cast Persist, and it costs 1 to cast Culling the Weak, but Culling the Weak generates 4, which results in an additional black mana every time we perform this loop, which means we'll have infinite black mana. And we can use that infinite mana to win in other ways. Of course, we can also loop this in other ways besides. So for example, if we have Sacrifice plus Victimize, we can victimize the Scholar of Ages and get back an additional creature, getting back all sorts of other creatures from our graveyard in addition to Scholar of Ages. And there's lots of different loops that you can perform with Scholar of Ages, depending on which sack outlets you have and which reanimation effects you have. Of course, Reanimate itself cannot go infinite because you lose life every time you use it, but you can use the other reanimation effects like Persist and Victimize, or sometimes Dread Return if you're sacking it to Sacrifice. Then we just have generically other fast mana cards such as Cabal Ritual, Dark Ritual, Lotus Petal in order to get Araumi going faster. We've got Songs of the Damned, which can also be a huge fast mana card depending on how many creature cards we have in the graveyard. Then we've got effects to either protect Araumi or allow us to activate it immediately, such as Lightning Greaves and Thousand Year Elixir. Also, Panharmonicon will double up the ETB triggers of various cards that we have, such as Mold Drifter, Scholar of Ages, and so on. So that itself can be a combo card. For example, with Scholar of Ages, you get 2 triggers, which means you can get back 4 spells total and go off with that. Or Encore in Mold Drifters, and then with Panharmonicon, you'll draw 12 cards instead of 6. So it can be a combo card, but also just a value card. Then we've got some other creatures that are just sort of untagged. Archaeomancer, unlike Scholar of Ages, can't do the same loops because it only gets back 1 card per trigger, but of course in combination with Panharmonicon, it can function as a Scholar of Ages, or just be a card that gets back multiple spells from the graveyard, again, if you Encore it. We've got Cloud of Fairies, which isn't as effective as Peregrine Drake, because it only untaps 2 lands instead of 5, but it can still provide a big mana boost, and potentially go off again if you combo it with cards like Panharmonicon and whatnot. And then we've got Grey Merchant of Asphodel. This is here basically just as a big value piece. EDH decks tend to hurt themselves a lot with effects like Ancient Tomb, Ad Nauseam, Bolus's Citadel, Mana Crypt, etc. This can be just a way to get back a bunch of life and drain our opponents out. So at bare minimum, if we Encore out a Grey Merchant and we just have the Grey Merchant tokens plus Araumi, the Grey Merchant tokens are copies of Grey Merchant. They are not blanked. So they do all have the same mana value, or the same mana cost rather. So you'll have 6 black pips from the 3 Grey Merchant tokens, and you'll have 1 black pip from Araumi being on the field. So that is 21 life drain right there, just off of the Grey Merchant Encores. And if you have anything else in play, such as additional black pips from other black permanents, or if you have Panharmonicon, it can be game winning on its own just to Encore this. Then we've got Cyclonic Rift, of course, various artifact ramp spells like Arcane Signet, Jeweled Lotus, Mana Vault, Mox Diamond, etc. And then we've got our tutors. So in this deck, we have the usual tutors like Vampiric Tutor, Imperial Seal, Demonic Tutor, but we also want to be able to tutor cards into our graveyard. So we have cards like Buried Alive and Entomb because we are doing 1 reanimation effect, and 2, we need to Encore things with Araumi, Mystical Tutor, Spellseeker, etc. And that is the basic breakdown of the Araumi deck. Our lands are pretty straightforward. They're just various combinations of Dimir lands. Some cards that stand out are Cephalid Colosseum. We're filling our graveyard up anyway, so the threshold's probably not too difficult to get online, and it can help us loot away cards we don't want and bin cards that we want to Encore with Araumi or reanimate. There's also a Monamo, which can untap Araumi or other legends, but primarily Araumi. There's the Mystic Sanctuary, Otawara, and then everything else is pretty straightforward. And that is the breakdown of the Araumi deck. Oh, of course, also a few counter spells in here just to make sure we can get our stuff through or counter various problem cards from our opponent. But that is the breakdown of the Araumi deck.